Okay, well, thank you for joining us, whether you're joining us live or you're watching this on a recording. We're pleased to have you here. The team is here. You've met us all before, but we'll start, I think, just by introducing ourselves and reminding you of our contributions, or at least those that you've seen so far and some that you will see in succeeding weeks. So I'm Bill Davis. I'm the lead educator on the course. I'm a crop scientist. You saw me in week one introduce the scale of the problem of food insecurity, and in week two we looked at possibilities for producing more food as a way of addressing this problem. And I was going to say 3 colleagues, but 4 colleagues, and Becky will explain to you why there are 4 of us.
Indeed. Do you want me to, shall I go now? Yeah, okay, so I'm Becky Whittle, and you're going to be meeting me principally next week and the following week, when we're going to be talking about some of the problems facing our food system and some of the alternative, like sort of agroecological approaches to dealing with it. So yeah, you'll see a lot more of me in the next few weeks. But my background is geography. I'm a human geographer, kind of sociologist, and this is my young son, who, when you get to see my weeks, you'll see me with a rather large tummy. He was inside, now he's currently out. He's obviously outside now, and he's currently asleep. So I'm really pleased to be joining you today, and hopefully he will stay asleep for the duration of this session, but we'll see how we get on.
Okay, and I'm Jane Taylor. We're intimately involved in the weeks that I've been involved with, so we've just finished week 4, about to go into week 5 to talk about nutrition in a bit more detail.
I'm Carly Stevens. We've just completed my week with week 3, looking at the balance between food production and protecting our environment.
Okay, well, we've got a list of questions here which you've submitted, and I think there is the opportunity still for you to submit questions live, and we'll try to deal with some of those as we go through. And in a moment I'll ask my colleagues to comment on some of the things that have particularly caught their attention. I think a comment that I should like to make at the outset is that you should have detected right from the start of this course, and if not, you would have had it underlined in the last few minutes. We represent here a range of disciplines. We're good colleagues and friends, and we work together towards this aim of addressing what we believe is a really serious global challenge. I think we've really been at pains right from the start to stress that we're not sure that there's a single solution, if indeed there is a solution to this set of challenges. And I think one of the comments I should like to make, based on your comments, or at least some of your comments, a lot of which set one approach, let's say, for example, to producing more food against another approach. And my very strong view is that at this stage we shouldn't be ruling out possibilities. We should be looking at all possibilities to address many of these, or indeed as many of these issues as we can. And rather than thinking of, well, this is really the way to go, I think try to think of how we might best go forward. And I suspect that from this discussion you'll get a feeling that we feel that a combination of our interests is likely to be most effective in addressing some of these real difficulties. So let's see if that's indeed how it plays out. Carly, I mean, do you want to start?
Yeah, so a question that perhaps I thought was a good one to start with was, someone asked, can organic methods feed 9 billion? And I chose that question to start with because actually I feel in short the answer is no. But it's not just organic methods. We can't feed 9 billion at the moment, and I think that's a really important point to make. Whether we use conventional or organic, there are a lot of problems, and it's not just related to production. But getting to the core of that question, which I think is really, do organic methods have sufficient production to feed the population? I think that at the moment, production from organic systems is generally lower. And there's been academic research into that show that most crop systems and most practices in the organic version will produce between 5 and 30% lower food amounts from that. So I think we need more research into the organic systems and the organic technologies to help us increase the production from those systems. We can't say it will never be the case, but at the moment it seems like the answer is no. It doesn't mean we don't want organic as part of the solution, but if we were to go entirely organic, we would face problems meeting the food demand. So I think another point that's associated with that is that the conventional agriculture, it doesn't need to be such a detrimental thing. And we saw a really good example in week 3 at Hope Farm, which is a conventional farm, but they're still putting an awful lot of effort into managing wildlife and maintaining good practices to ensure that the effect of the agriculture on the environment is not too much of a negative one, and actually in some ways it's a very positive one. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Well, there's quite a lot of research going on currently into field margins and using field margins to actually sustain insects that can actually act as pollinators and actually help in terms of the biodiversity in conventional agriculture. And one might think that this is actually quite an easy question, but in fact it's actually quite complex, because depending on the types of plants you have there and the types of flower they have, particular insects will feed on particular plants. So it's about thinking about what the pests are, what the predators that you want to get into that will be a particular type of a mixture of seeds. So there's quite a lot of research going on trying to understand what that intimate link is between the two. So I think there's some knowledge that we still don't have. You know, it might seem relatively obvious, but in fact it's knowledge that we don't have at all in some cases.
Becky, you talked to some organic farmers. I know that our collaborators in this exercise haven't seen this yet, but or possibly not.
No.
But they were very impressive people, I think.
They were really impressive, and I think for me, absolutely supporting the point that Carly made. I think often these kind of debates can get really polarised, like it's all organic or it's all GM, and it's actually, no, there's a whole spectrum going on here, and I think in terms of producers and their own individual approaches to it, I think something that everyone's mentioned here that I really support is that I think there is an awful lot more potential for, in fact this probably leads on, and the questions that I was really interested in were those questions about, is it the case, we have to do GM or we have to go organic, is it like a polarised thing like that, and what people wanting to know, what are the alternatives to industrialised farming and factory farming? Can we feed the world with, without going down those routes? And my hunch that as Carly said, we can't prove any of this either way. We're hypothesising about the future, but my approach would be that absolutely yes, I would like to really think that we can. But the difficulty is that at the moment, there's some really creative, some really good approaches going on, very grassroots projects involving organic farmers, involving community growing in cities, edible landscaping, and permaculture and agroforestry approaches, which we'll cover quite a lot more in the next couple of weeks, but essentially looking at how to get more people involved in growing kind of different food crops on spaces that will be rejected by kind of conventional agriculture because it's not profitable at the moment to grow in those spaces. So it kind of involves different economic models, different social models. And I think there's some really great examples of really innovative work, like Bill mentioned, going on, but it's often going on by practitioners, and they could do with a lot more support from researchers and from science. It's, that I think these approaches are often thought of as being anti-science, and that's absolutely not the case at all. They often really would like input from researchers to know, how they could make the techniques work better. But unfortunately, like a lot of research money, the processes we have to go through to get funding often do gravitate towards the high tech, the kind of high. So, my own sort of view on this would be that things like GM get a lot more attention and a lot more research funding, and the same in that, conventional agriculture involves quite highly subsidised production based very heavily on fossil fuels, and so I think we really need to look at the alternatives. But at the moment, the resources, I feel like those alternative approaches could do with a lot more kind of financial support in terms of research and time to develop them. And as Bill said, it's absolutely not the sort of thing that one discipline can solve. I think that it's something that chefs have got a contribution here, farmers, landscape architects, city planners. I think these are all people that probably currently wouldn't think of themselves as part of the food security jigsaw, but I absolutely think their contribution is crucial. So yeah.
Yeah, I should like to make a comment. I'm an agroecologist, and I work in many of the areas which would be considered to be components of organic agriculture. And a point that I made in discussions with the Soil Association and others, I think that differentiation often between conventional agriculture and organic agriculture is not so clear. I mean, many farmers that we might describe as running large-scale, often multinational operations, they are vitally interested in things like soil quality, soil biodiversity, other kinds of biodiversity, as Jane has mentioned. And so, I think personally that there's a case for defining as precisely as we can the issues that are involved in food production, the benefits and some of the adverse consequences, and using all the methods potentially that are available to us to address those. And I'm sure that your point about less funding in agroecology is probably right, but the industry, and I think some very good examples through the book of where various companies illustrate how they really pay attention to the small things in the production process to try to increase the sustainability of what they do or the productivity of what they do. And many of those, although those production systems wouldn't necessarily be described as organic, I mean, many of those issues are things that organic producers do routinely. So, there's an issue there, but I'm not sure that the sides are always necessarily so far apart.
No, I agree.
So, Jane.
Well, you mentioned something there about soil, and I know Carly had a question that she's quite interested in about quality of soil.
Yeah, so someone asked, is the soil damaged beyond repair as a result of industrial farming, and should we be taking soil health more seriously? And the second part of that question is incredibly easy to answer. Yes, we really should be taking soil health more seriously. Soil is absolutely vital for food production, and if we damage our soils too much, we'll damage our yields. Beyond any of the environmental impacts, there's a definite production answer as well. But there's another side to that, and actually soils can recover fairly well. And the soil is actually a habitat packed full of biological organisms. It's virtually alive. There's so many components of the soil that are living. And even when soils have been heavily impacted, they will recover. The problem is that it takes a very long time for them to do that, and it can take hundreds and hundreds of years for soils to form, depending on the climate and other environmental factors. So the soils will recover eventually, and we have damaged them very heavily, particularly in some parts of the world. But I think they will recover in time, but the less damage we do in the first place, the better, and the less likely we are to actually damage the thing that we really do need for the production of food.
I'd also say, as somebody who's been working in this general area for a very long time, I think I can see that particular governments now recognising the importance of soil and soil health, and suddenly there's a lot of money coming into research in that sort of area. So I think we're just on the cusp of actually funding some really fundamental work that will enable us to do a lot in a number of years' time. But I think that's correct, isn't it? I think soils become more sexy, if you like, in terms of trying to understand the food production system.
It's probably an area where there are really good career opportunities, because we do hear on a very regular basis we need more capacity in soil science. It's an area which is identified as a vulnerable capability.
One of the questions that was in here was really about how we're going to prepare for the transition from mechanised agriculture. So when we run out of all the oil-based energy and things that go into making things like fertilisers, herbicides, insecticides, how are we going to deal with that transition? Well, I would hope certainly in the next week you'll be able to see some of the tools that people are trying to develop. So we're trying to understand the natural environment more and use what we learn about that natural environment to put it to good use in a context, say, in my case, my interest is in pesticides. So you'll see discussion about push-pull technology, which is about effectively what people have known for a very long time, effectively companion planting, but it's putting it into a more agricultural setting so you can deal with pests and diseases in a much more natural way. Something I'm particularly interested in is looking for how that understanding of plant biology, we can use some of the chemicals that plants naturally use to deal with pests and pathogens. And one of those chemicals that increases in response to attack in plants is a substance called jasmonic acid. And we've been looking for ways in which we can use this chemical to actually apply it back to the system for it to deliver some pesticidal properties. And we've now managed to do that, and in fact we've shown we can get it to work in various different major and significant crops, and we hope this will feed forward into products that will be out there and that will be helping agriculture worldwide to use what I would call a more natural system. It's still using a chemical, but it's something that a plant would naturally produce. But to use it in a slightly different way and to manipulate it so we can get plants working in a way that is in a sense helpful to us, because there we can get them to deal with that attack much more rapidly and actually deliver some pest resistance. The other thing I think we've discussed in the MOOC is participatory plant breeding. I don't know whether somebody else wants to talk, or somebody else knows a bit more about that than me. Is that for you?
Well, yes. I mean, I should like to say a little bit. I think before I do that, I sort of just like to go back to the original question about moving away from mechanised agriculture. And while I wouldn't necessarily take issue with the desirability of doing that under many circumstances, it does require more people involved in agriculture. And I've just spent 10 days in China with our collaborating researchers. And the issue there is a stark issue that many people, its society has traditionally been based on smallholder farms, and many people have moved away from there, largely because they can see better opportunities economically for them in the cities. The economy is growing, and clearly you all know about that. It's in the media every day. And so China is having to grapple with this situation that they previously had literally millions of people involved in producing food, and they're going to have to move to a different system. And there is an active debate over just how that can happen. It's going to involve potentially some land reform, but certainly some investigation of the way that food is produced. And traditionally, each family has had access to a 15th of a hectare. And we have people at this meeting, we're actually looking at impacts of agriculture on the environment, and particularly if there's a little bit of time later, I'll say a little bit more about it, but there are people there from all over the country, all over the world. And one Australian scientist was talking about farming in Australia on farms of 10,000 hectares or more. So, there are a lot of 15ths of a hectare in 10,000 hectares, and so we're talking about radically different ways of producing food involving, potentially very large numbers of people who at the moment don't see much in it for them. And so you can see we made the point, I think, time and time again, there are lots of social and economic issues here, many of which are not directly to do with food. And while things may seem logical to us from the perspective of the UK, clearly there is lots to understand if we're to effectively be involved in changing the world.
Were you going to say about participatory plant breeding, Bill, as well?
I was. Sorry. Yes, I mean, the reason I started talking about China was that we have some very, very good collaborators in the Chinese Academy of Science who work with farmers to produce new varieties of plants that are well suited, ideally, to the particular problems, biotic problems, abiotic problems faced by farmers in particular parts of the world. And these are very, very interesting results which can reap benefits for communities at a very local level. The idea is to connect the science more directly with the producers, and there is some very distinguished work that has gone on, for example, at Bangor University over the years that has impacted very significantly in Asia. So again, this is plant breeding, but it's a different way of producing novel genotypes, which clearly can impact positively as far as farmers and producers are concerned.
I think that's what Bill just mentioned there is a really good example of the types of approaches that I wanted to talk about, and what I mean when I say that kind of agroecological, like what we might think of as like alternative approaches to food security, by no means have to be anti-science. I think if you consider the fact that the majority of food actually in the world is actually produced by smallholder farmers who often have very different needs, both in terms of their actual farming practices, but also economically and socially, it's a very different sort of regime from kind of like large scale industrial farming. And the project that Bill mentions is a brilliant example of where researchers, rather than kind of flying in and attempting to do some kind of silver bullet that's going to be applied globally, they've actually gone to the local farmers, worked with them to understand their problems, worked with their farming practices, and actually helped them develop a very actually low tech but sophisticated way that they can actually use their own knowledge and breed their own varieties that are perfect for that specific microclimate and their particular farming practices they work in. So I think that really ties in well with what we've all been saying, that these foods, I mean, it would be lovely if we could kind of come up with some, this is going to solve food security across the world, but actually I think that the approaches are going to be really, really different, and they're going to be apply, that there are going to be a myriad of local solutions that are all, what's going to work in one place is going to be completely different to what works in another, and I think we really need to support those kind of creative bottom-up approaches to dealing with the problems like where we live. And I think also, what Bill and Jane were just saying, it really does feed into the importance of thinking about the social and the economic and ethical implications of all this as well, which is something that our colleague Jeff Tansey from the Food Ethics Council, he really wanted to join us today, and he'd be a brilliant person to ask about all these things. So, I won't be able to speak to this as well as he could, but essentially, and there was another question I was really interested in that was actually saying, about is it possible, why can't we create more jobs in agriculture? It's a way of reconnecting people with food, a way perhaps of getting around the fact that fossil fuels are, this huge mechanisation of agriculture won't be able to go on forever. And that kind of, certainly in the UK, that is already happening. There's been quite an interesting debate in the news about I think it's the Land Workers Alliance, they're a group of kind of like smallholder farmers in the UK that have been, people often who've come from jobs in the city and have gone back to the land because it's something that they believe passionately and ethically in food security, and they want to get a better life for themselves and their families, take care of the environment. But they've been arguing that DEFRA, our Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and our National Farmers Union are not sort of effectively protecting their interests because they have a very different approach to farming. And obviously they believe passionately that working in agriculture can be a really satisfying, a really valuable job. And I think unfortunately a lot of the sort of supposedly developed world, we've kind of devalued agriculture, and a lot of that also has to do with Again, something Jeff could talk very well about, but access to land and resources and the price of land, and that doesn't just apply obviously here in the UK, that's a huge issue in Africa and stuff, where you've got, unfortunately, lots of smallholder farmers kind of being unable to access the land they need for, because perhaps big corporate interests are coming in and purchasing that, that land at prices that local people can't afford. So that, that's another way in which food security can be compromised. So I think, here in the UK and in places like the USA, you get things like, for example, urban farming initiatives, community farms, community-supported agriculture projects, and a lot of those are an attempt to, even the traditional allotment system actually is an attempt to sort of address people's lack of access to be able to provide for themselves and their families. So it's sort of communal approaches to, can we take unused bits of land and help people to grow some food on it, to support themselves and their families. Because otherwise, purchasing that land in the economic system that we've got at the moment just isn't an option for most people.
I've got another question, which is a very specific one really, which is about how can food producers and manufacturers protect themselves against food fraud and contamination. Well, this is one really good way of applying science. So we can carry out methods that look at the DNA in particular foods. So we can use a technique called the polymerase chain reaction, which can actually detect DNA from a particular species, and there are particular markers you can use. So you can take some food, you can do these tests, and it will tell you what actual animals are in those foods. And that's why in the horse meat scandal that was in the UK, that's how it was worked out what animals were actually in any of these foodstuffs. Equally, we can do, just as you can do a DNA fingerprint on a suspect in a crime case, that's a similar technique as well to enable you to, so you can do a DNA fingerprint of a particular plant or animal species, and then you can know what's in your foodstuff. So science can deliver those sorts of things to enable us to really understand what it is that we're eating on our plate. So I think that certainly has a role to play.
I had another question that perhaps gives another good example of how science can be applied. And the question was, what is being done to protect the insects that pollinate the plants? And we've been aware of this issue and the declines in pollinators for a number of years now. And when we look at what's causing that, and the paper that you read in week 3, it shows that actually it's a whole range of different issues that are contributing globally to the decline in pollinators. But one of the things that has potentially been identified and is very controversial at the moment is the problem of use of insecticides, and particularly the neonicotinoids. And those are in the process of being banned within Europe, quite controversially, because some believe the evidence base behind that isn't strong enough. So that's a debate that's very current at the moment. But there is a lot of research going on into how we can improve conditions for pollinators, whether that's related to the habitats that they live in and providing additional habitats, providing corridors to link habitats. But also in the news just last week, there was a development, a group of scientists at Newcastle University who've been using venom from the funnel web spider from Australia and combining it with a protein from snowdrops, and using that to develop a new pesticide. So the research is really being developed, and it's all happening at the moment. So scientists are working towards solutions, but it takes time.
I mean, this whole idea of pesticides and a more integrated form of pest management is a very interesting one. I mean, Jane is an expert in this area, so I shouldn't say too much, but they're very difficult decisions to make, aren't they? I mean, farmers
need to control
particular things.
Yeah, and quite a lot of the integrated pest management strategies you can apply are relatively easy to apply in a contained environment, so for protected crops, so things like peppers, cucumbers, lettuce, those sorts of things, which are often grown in an enclosed environment, because you can then let out a whole bunch of predators into that environment, and they're going to be there and they're going to be instant at the right levels to control the pests. Obviously, once you get out into a field, that's a whole different ballpark. But I think even some of the what people might think of as big corporations, big chemical companies, are now realising that even the chemicals they produce aren't the things that are going to completely deal with situations. And there is a video that's on the MOOC which talks about something that's now happened in Australia, where the chemical company has worked closely with people who are dealing with IPM type strategies, and they've come together and worked in collaboration to work out what's the best use of pesticides to put in place when you're actually putting other insects in there that can also deal with those pests, because obviously potentially they're going to be impacted as well. So I think there is a move now to try and across the piece, and particularly in large global companies, they see that, you know, you can't just keep going down one track. You need to obviously diversify and innovate, and I think that Australia video I recommend, because I think it is a really good step forward.
Okay, Becky, anything that you'd like to raise?
Well, I think we've sort of touched on the questions I was interested in about the land rights and access issues, employment in agriculture. I think these are all like really important parts of the debate. I mean, without people to actually, unless we can make these kind of more alternative and environmentally and socially sort of friendly production techniques, unless we can make them economically viable, then, you know, that we're in a very difficult situation as regards like using them as solutions. But I think again this is what I mean about how, and hopefully, you know, you're all going to be part of this as well. I mean, I'm sure we've got people on the course who've got really diverse backgrounds, and that's why it absolutely does need more than scientists, you know, economists, and like I said, there's some very creative approaches kind of to these things happening at grassroots level that I think would benefit from, you know, from collaboration with researchers and also with people from other disciplines. I think this is going to be have to be a meeting of many minds to kind of to work this out. Obviously the land tenure issues we've discussed already, and I think you know, particularly in areas like, you know, in Africa and things. I mean, one thing that I think is quite interesting that we probably haven't talked about perhaps so much so far has been like the scale at which we look at these problems. In the next week and the following week that I'm going to spend with you, we'll talk quite a lot about local food production and local approaches. And local food's an interesting one because, you know, obviously just because a production method is local doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be, you know, perfect environmentally or socially. You know, you could live right next door to a industrialised kind of chemicals making factory, and that would still be local. But, you know, it's that's not necessarily a good example, but I think it's about having solutions, like working with people on solutions that are appropriate, sort of actually, you know, in the areas where you live, and they're going to be really different. So I think it's just waking up a minute. I might have to hand it to someone else. I'll just unleash him, and you keep talking amongst yourselves, and we might see if we can get to sell them.
Well, it's quite interesting that your baby's waking up. I mean, one of the things I think that's come through, we talked about the difference between, you know, it's all very well going and saying we need to produce more food, but actually if we reduce the amount of waste, we can have a significant impact. And there has been a debate about, you know, are we actually teaching our next generation this issue about waste? So we might teach them about what I used to call home economics, food technology now. Yeah. But are we actually talking to them about thinking about the waste they're producing and the way, you know, the way they use food?
Like sit and maybe come back again. There we are.
So one of the things that we try and do as people at LEC, we do quite a lot of outreach work. So I'm very keen to do this sort of stuff with the younger generation. So we might bring in a bunch of kids from junior schools, so they might be somewhere between 7 and 11. And I have this table where I have packets of things like pasta and various different other foodstuffs, and I say to the kids, where do you think this comes from? And obviously you get the obvious comment, well, it comes from a supermarket. Yeah, but where does it really come from? And then I work through with them, you know, going really back to the field and thinking about the crop, and I have some wheat tucked away so they can have a look at that. And I think it's this lack of link between what actually happens in the growing environment compared to what actually arrives on the supermarket shelf. That is something that we're going to have to start making more of, I think, and doing more education in that sort of sense.
Well, perhaps a slightly different type of question. One that had interested me was someone asked, is there any justification in producing produce for conversion into fuel? And I think this is a really interesting and challenging question, because there's moral and scientific arguments from both sides. So taking land away from food production instead of using it to produce fuel obviously has some serious implications, and in some parts of the world where food is scarce, that's a really big problem potentially, because food is not distributed evenly, and actually many of the areas that are short of food are those that are under pressure to make the money more, and so switching to producing fuel seems appealing. But our constant demand for fossil fuels and the environmental problems that result from that are also very serious. So it feels like we're in a sort of lose-lose situation. What do we do? So I don't have an answer at all. My personal opinion is that exploring options that don't detract from food production would probably be more productive. So we should be looking more at wind and at solar, and even using food waste to produce energy. And there's an example that I saw in the news just last week, a food waste digester that's opening up near Surrey and serving Surrey and London, and that will take food waste from that households produce and that industry and that produce, and instead of going to landfill, that waste will be digested to produce energy. So that's a good news story. Something is happening that's good. It's not taking land away from production. But of course, on the other side of that, if we didn't waste so much food, this sort of operation wouldn't even be viable. So it almost just highlights another problem in our food production systems.
Yeah, we had there are, I think, 2 or 3 occasions as we move through the weeks where we have looked at anaerobic digestion, and there are some very good examples in the UK now, and I think there's one not far from here associated with a tomato growing business, and to produce tomatoes in the UK you need to strip off the leaves to allow more radiation into the crop to get the fruit growing. And all of those, from a big farm, they produce a lot of leaves, and those leaves go straight into a digester. And from the point of view of the farming business, it's potentially additional source of income. It's feeding power into the grid, and presumably the power is also running aspects of the business. I mean, that was certainly the case in the business that we looked at. I think in week 3, was it, Jane? A digester down on a farm on the south coast. And for me, the very interesting aspect of that was that they were getting so-called digestate out of the digester, along with the heat and the power, and also a substrate at the end, which they use as a soil conditioner. But the digestate, of course, has very large, high concentrations of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and they're using it as a fertilizer on the farm. And I think the farmer said, whether he actually said it in the video, I'm not sure, but he said that since this business had been operating, they hadn't bought any inorganic fertilizer. So clearly that's a positive in all sorts of senses. They also seem convinced that the digestate is less likely to run off from the field into streams, rivers, where inevitably those nutrients do cause problems. So the environmental impact of agriculture is reduced in a number of different ways. that digester is run entirely with waste from the food production process, and some waste food which comes out from London. So I think you can see just how sophisticated the food production business is these days. But I mean, the other point which really comes across to me is the amount of attention that the supply chain is giving to issues of sustainability in all sorts of ways. Many of those companies are importing food from other parts of the world. They follow the sun. They get very high rates of productivity. They ship the food to this country by ship rather than by air now. Many companies have effectively done away entirely with air freight, which is much more environmentally questionable. And when they calculate the carbon footprint of these operations, it's actually lower than, in many cases, than food which is produced more locally. And this is because of the high rate of productivity, the amount of energy provided by the sun, productivity provided by the sun in places like North Africa and other parts of the world. So it's not, in this case, not a case of food miles. Obviously, there are very large numbers of food miles. It's a case of carbon footprint, and it's a good news story for much of that operation.
In terms of, I mean, something that comes to mind is that we've sort of had some of the questions have been really around sort of big agriculture as opposed to smaller farmers. And I know, Carly, we talked previously in somewhere else about the fact that there are some really, really fantastic examples of people that are growers and farmers that are taking on board this holistic approach. But I guess the question is, how many people are there? And for a grower to be able to do that, they probably have to be a certain size, because obviously this all requires investment. And so, I don't know how much a digester costs, but yeah, it's a lot of money. So not everybody's going to be able to do that. So I think that is something, and again, I guess one of the things we're talking about here are things that potentially are very local to Europe or the UK, but we're very aware that we're talking to a global audience, and some of these things might actually be possible in other places around the world just because of the scale of it, not necessarily because they're very sort of wealthy producers as such, but just that scale effect might actually help some of this stuff to be transported into a place. I don't know what you think. I mean, is scale an issue, do you think? Do you have to have enough of it to warrant actually taking that sort of approach?
Yeah, no, I think that is right. I mean, again, it's difficult to talk about some of this because you haven't seen some of the interviews, but we have tried to unpack later in the course this issue of moving food around the world and the impact that it has on the communities where the food is actually produced. And our contributors there have, I think, talked about some interesting, both positive and negative impacts. And so you can see those in week 8, and there'll be an opportunity to obviously discuss those at that time. Hello again.
Hello. He was just interested in his own food security. Thank you for a little break. What have we been discussing? Anything that I can contribute to? Or
well, I was actually going to ask you at the point you talked about local food.
Yes.
And it links with the point I was just making. I mean, Camilla Toulmin from International Institute for Environmental Development in London. I talked to her in week 8 and asked her about local initiatives which she has proposed, and indeed, I mean, you made that point.
Yeah.
Anywhere in the world, whether in the context of just the scale of these challenges, how much impact can we really hope to make? I don't want that to sound negative or defeatist at all. I saw some fantastic examples in China where Our collaborators at China Agricultural University are working with farmers, enormous numbers of farmers. Their students are going into schools to spread the word. This is how you can save water. And these are life and death issues for these people. But even so, I hesitate to use the term a drop in a bucket when I'm talking about water. But China's such a massive country, there aren't enough scientists to go around. And what's our way ahead here?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the interesting things, and it's something that I'm going to talk about a bit in the next couple of weeks with local production, is that people often sort of, when they see local food initiatives and they say, oh yeah, they can't feed the world, they often just look at the scale of food currently produced by such initiatives, which, somewhere like in the UK, for example, is really fairly small. But actually, I think for me, the value they've got is that they are bringing together they're creating different food systems. They're bringing consumers and producers together to think about their food in a different way. I think one of the things, in fact, even since having my son, that's really come home to me, is that food's a crucial way of how we relate to each other and the environment. And I think it's about building those relationships and kind of coming together and finding creative local solutions. So, for example, if you've got a community-supported agriculture farm, and that isn't just about the production, it's about actually, finding different ways of getting that through to market, in which, we might, I know James talks a lot about food waste, but I think, if I give my own example, completely sort of separately to my job, we got an allotment sort of 3 years ago, and since we've got an allotment, our food waste and our diet has totally shifted towards what is kind of locally and seasonally available and what we've grown, and it will affect, what I feed Russell as well. So I think it's really, people often, I think when they think about local production, they just think about the production, but actually it involves people building a different relationship with food, like socially and economically. And I think that can get around a lot of the, I think if you can create, for example, local markets for food that actually work well, and that can also go towards solving a lot of the, I'll visit a food bank actually next week, we'll see. I think that's another issue we probably haven't talked about enough, maybe, is food sort of poverty in the supposedly developed world. But I think, there's a real passionate need to, something's gone wrong somewhere in the ways in which we actually relate to food, and I think if we can kind of rebuild that in a positive way that enables us to, be fair to each other, sort of economically, but also, take care of the environment and wildlife at the same time, then I think, that for me is the holy grail. I think we need to sort of reshape our food systems, and I say systems because, like I say, yes, exactly. I don't think there's going to be one kind of global solution, and I think the local level is where a lot of these creative, these new relationships are being built. So and I'm sure it'd be really interesting to hear about other people's experiences of kind of local production issues, and how those local projects are affecting things in the areas where they live. But it's just, as I say, it's creating different ways in which people can access food. So it's just, I think that's the key point I'd make really, is it just goes much further than just the growing of products actually into the whole ways in which we access food, the ways we cook food. Here in the UK, you think of Jamie Oliver, what he did with school dinners really, and it wasn't just about the calories and the nutrients going into those children. It was about actually them learning about eating as a social activity and where their food comes from, sort of ethically and environmentally, and if you're eating animal products, how those animals are treated. So I think all those issues are really are a crucial part of this whole question really. It's not just about calories or nutrients, it's about food as a social, as an ethical, as an environmental activity.
It's also interesting is we've had a number of people comment about being party to world wars in Europe, and talking about bringing back ration books and things, and it's that knowledge, isn't it, of a generation that actually gives some worth to food and understand what those issues are. We have sort of moved away from that, and I don't quite know how we go about instilling that in the generations to come. Perhaps we should write to the government and change that. I think food technology course or something.
I mean, there are a couple of issues. I mean, in relation to what you've just said that intrigue me. I mean, we said a little bit about urban food production. I actually saw an article in the paper the weekend about goats in Detroit. Detroit is obviously a city with a lot of economic problems, a lot of abandoned land, and clearly difficult place to live, but I think there is an active urban farming movement there, and this article was focusing on one aspect of that. But the pride of a community in its environment is all tied up in regeneration of areas which have been, for whatever reason, allowed to deteriorate is possible. But I just wonder if we could think a little bit about, the UK as a whole. There was a very interesting question about farming systems in Britain, and while eating meat and producing meat maybe seem to be environmentally less desirable than a fundamentally vegetarian diet, it is an important part of our cultural heritage. Most people look at Britain, they expect to see sheep and cows and various other things wandering around, and those are the things that very largely keep Britain looking the way it does.
Exactly.
I mean, the point that's made in the comment that I've got on the top here is that actually a lot of the land that's used, upland particularly, that's used for meat production, couldn't really be used for anything else.
Exactly, and it's a traditional method of farming and managing the landscape. So I think, when exactly as you say, that's why local is so important. Is when you think about these issues, you've always got to think about them in context, of what are what's the local environment like, what are the kind of employment patterns of people, what do people expect the landscape to look like? I mean, that's a huge, especially as you say, in the case of the UK is a prime example of that, because we've got such a big population. The way that our countryside looks is a product of particular farming practices. So hedgerows being a classic example of that kind of thing. So I think that's why this is such a multi-dimensional problem. But another thing I think is quite interesting with regard to that, and certainly something that I've found again through having our allotment and community garden, this chatty man here, is that it's there are so many things that it's possible for us to eat that are really nutritious, grow really well in our landscape, that you just don't find in supermarkets, because they're not, no one's grown them on a commercial scale, and they're probably not, even, it'd be very hard to grow them in an economically viable way. But actually, those, in terms of, if you think about food security and all the kind of things that we could eat and the wide variety of nutrients we could be getting, I think that our diets could much better be adapted to suit our local environmental conditions and the kinds of the kind of soils, the kind of climates that we have. And so I think there's some quite interesting research going on into local and seasonal diets and regional diets as well. A lot of those recipes that Jane talks about cooking in schools, but you think things like, for example, in our area, Lancashire hot pot was like a product of particular kinds of using up bits of land that wouldn't have got any use in other ways. So it was a dish born out of particular economic and climatic conditions.
I think there's a counter to that, because obviously in the UK that animal rearing and animal-based agriculture, it is essential for maintaining our landscape if we want to keep it as it is, and it's very much part of our cultural history. But there's parts of the world where the habitats that are perhaps the more important ones are being destroyed at very large scales to make way for that meat production. Yes. So although perhaps if we were all eating local food, it would be less of a problem. That meat-based diet in the UK would not be environmentally damaging as it is in other parts of the world. But if we look at areas where huge tracts of rainforest have been cut down to rear beef in a way that actually the environmental impact of that is awful, because it's causing terrible soil erosion, it's causing awful water issues, and all these things going on related to it, as well as the loss of biodiversity. So it's very much like you say, it depends on the local situation whether these things are appropriate or not.
Okay, well, I'm conscious of the time. We've got a few minutes left. I mean, could we go along and just give a good news story or something that, we don't necessarily have to be positive, something that particularly concerns you for the future? I mean, I'll do one minute. I'm itching to tell my China story because it is a good news. I've been in northwest China with some students this last week. It's an area which is very, very fragile ecologically. It's fed by runoff from snowmelt on the mountains, an inland river system. Rivers flow to the desert. And this is a culturally very important area. 50 years ago, there was an enormous lake here, which has dried up, partly probably as a result of climate change, but largely because farmers have used too much water. Not only have they used all the river so it doesn't flow to the lower part of the valley any longer, but they pump water from ground, water tables dropped, natural vegetation's died, and desertification, the area's become a desert. And the Chinese government about 15 years ago decided that this was one of the things that must be reversed. And so a big group of researchers led by the Agricultural University in China have applied themselves to this. And this year, for the first time in 50 years, there is water in this Kintu Lake, which was, as I say, an enormous lake at one time. And the impact, that has all been brought about by working with farmers to show them how to use less water, closing down wells, changing farming practices, nothing very sophisticated, lots of alternative farming methods, and in my view, ecologically and probably sociologically for the people who live there, a massive success story.
For me, I think making the week that I made related to ecology and conservation in agricultural systems, actually it was really good to just see so many success stories, so many places that we were able to go, and there was so much choice in which farms we went to where they were doing things really well, and that was really, really encouraging. And, you know, we've seen examples that people have contributed from all over the world of good practice. So it is out there, it's just spreading that more widely.
Okay.
For me, I think in the RAP report that we've directed you to in the Waste Week, what's clear from that is the UK is beginning to reduce its food waste. So that is a really good news story. What we've got to do is get the message out there to more, though, and get more of that happening.
And I'd say, I mean, I have two good news stories. Is that right? I think one would be I think one approach that's really inspired me has been the incredible edibles movement, which if you don't know about it already, you're going to find out about over the next couple of weeks. Which is a real example, I think, spread worldwide now, of people locally kind of saying, well, you know what, we're not going to wait for the politicians and stuff to kind of make a stance on these issues. We're going to do something about them right now in the places where we live. So, you know, that involves growing food in urban areas and spaces that would be completely sort of neglected by, just like around the edges of car parks, bare patches of grass on, roundabouts, creating wildlife zones, all this kind of thing. It's a great movement, and it gets local people involved and thinking about where the food comes from. I was going to say, I mean, I hope this isn't blowing around. I think this course is hopefully going to be a good news story, because we're all from very different backgrounds, and I know some of the people, obviously the people that we've made the films with as well, some of the practitioners and people that fortunately couldn't join us today, that I know I've been really inspired by talking to them and all the different things that, collaborating and sharing our sort of our passion for and our interest in kind of trying to solve these issues together. And obviously you're all part of this, this community as well. So I just really think these kind of conversations, there's so much in the media, a lot of it gets focused obviously on the GM issue, but becomes polarised and not very productive debate, quite frankly. So it's really nice to see, to try and create, we certainly don't agree like all of the time, but I mean, creating forum in which people can actually meet and talk together and share ideas and expertise, and hopefully, we're not going to get it right all the time, but hopefully we're moving in the right direction.
Okay, well said. I'd like to underline our delight at the general level of commitment here from you and your enthusiasm. Hopefully you'll continue to contribute. We haven't said so much about diet, I think, but of course that's the subject of this week, and there's plenty of opportunity for you to comment there about what you'd rather eat and what you don't think we should be eating, or we definitely should be. And then we'll move on to Becky's units, and then we'll try to pull a lot of this together in week 8. And we've asked a group of people there to look ahead, try to choose a selection of people who represent different points of view and hopefully leave you with a positive feeling on what can be achieved in many of these different areas. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll look forward to continue interacting with you. Thank you.
Yes.